The common understanding of the Cold War is that it was a long standoff, a period of tension managed through diplomacy and deterrence, a conflict that never quite became a war. That understanding is wrong, not partially wrong, not oversimplified, fundamentally, structurally, dangerously wrong. What the public has been allowed to believe about the Cold War is a version of events cleaned up after the fact, stripped of the specific moments where civilization came within minutes, sometimes seconds, of ending. The reality that lived inside classified vaults, inside the heads of men who could not legally speak about what they had witnessed, inside the sealed annexes of documents that would not be declassified for decades, was something else entirely. It was a war fought on paper, rehearsed in bunkers, automated into launch protocols, and sustained by a bureaucratic machinery so vast and so compartmentalized that no single person ever held a complete picture of it. And the most disturbing part is not that it nearly ended the world. The most disturbing part is how many times it nearly ended the world without anyone intending it to. What follows is an account of 26 contingency plans that the public never saw. Not rumors, not speculation. Documents that have since been partially or fully declassified, incidents reconstructed from witness testimony and archival research, decisions that were made in basements and war rooms, and aboard submarines and inside mountain fortresses carved into solid rock. The scale of what was prepared, what was rehearsed, and what was nearly executed during the Cold War era represents perhaps the most comprehensive institutional commitment to potential mass destruction in human history. And it was maintained with the same administrative diligence that a government might apply to tax collection or road construction. To understand the weight of these contingency plans, it helps to understand the environment that produced them. By the late 1940s, the United States and the Soviet Union had emerged from the Second World War not as allies in any meaningful sense, but as competing systems with incompatible ideological foundations, both possessing or rapidly developing weapons of a kind the world had never encountered before. The atomic bomb had changed not just warfare, but the psychology of governance. Every decision made at the highest levels of both governments now carried the implicit shadow of total annihilation. Planners on both sides understood, even if they could not publicly acknowledge it, that a certain category of mistake would have no recovery. There would be no armistice after a nuclear exchange. There would be no reconstruction. There would be, at best, a diminished remnant of human civilization picking through the remains of everything that had been built. This understanding produced a paradox. The weapons existed to prevent their own use. The threat had to be credible enough that no rational actor would invite retaliation. But the threshold for use had to remain controlled enough that miscommunication or mechanical failure could not trigger what rational decision-making was supposed to prevent. What the contingency plans reveal, one after another, is that this balance was never as stable as the public was told. The systems designed to prevent accidental war contained within them the seeds of accidental war. The protocols designed to ensure human judgment remained in the loop were regularly circumvented, sometimes deliberately, sometimes because no one had anticipated a particular failure mode, sometimes because the humans in the loop made errors that no protocol had been designed to catch. The first of these plans, and in some ways the most foundational, was the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which entered into existence in 1960 under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and immediately became one of the most tightly held documents in the American government. Before the PSYOP, as it came to be called, the United States operated under a fragmented system of nuclear targeting in which the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force each maintained separate target lists, separate weapons allocations, and separate launch authorities. The result was a system with enormous redundancy in a particularly dangerous sense, where multiple American weapons might be assigned to the same Soviet target, while other Soviet targets went uncovered entirely. The PSYOP was designed to rationalize this chaos, to create a single unified nuclear war plan that coordinated all American nuclear forces under a coherent strategic framework. What the PSYOP actually produced, when the first version was briefed to the Kennedy administration in early 1961, was a document so extreme in its assumptions and its projected casualties that several senior officials came away from the briefing visibly shaken. The plan called for the simultaneous delivery of every available nuclear weapon against the Soviet Union, China, and the Eastern Bloc satellite states in a single coordinated strike. The projected casualty figures were in the hundreds of millions. The plan made no distinction between military targets and population centers in any meaningful operational sense. It assumed that once a nuclear war began, the only rational response was to expend every available weapon as rapidly as possible, on the theory that any weapon not used in the first hours of a conflict might be destroyed before it could be used at all. The Kennedy administration was appalled. They requested the development of options that fell short of total nuclear employment. They were told, essentially, that the targeting architecture of the existing plan did not readily accommodate limited options. The machinery of total war had been built, and it was not easily reconfigured to produce anything less. The existence of the PSYOP and its successive revisions across 4 decades represent something important about how contingency planning operated during this period. Plans were not neutral instruments that waited passively for political decisions. Plans shaped the decisions available to policymakers by determining what options existed, what forces were allocated where, and what the first hours of a nuclear conflict would look like before any human being in a position of authority had a chance to intervene. The PSYOP was not a plan that a president would consult when deciding whether to go to war. It was a plan that would execute automatically once a threshold was crossed, and the question of exactly where that threshold was located and who had the authority to cross it was far less clear than any public statement about civilian control of the military suggested. The second contingency plan that shaped the Cold War in ways the public never understood was the American system of pre-delegated launch authority. The official position of the United States government throughout the Cold War was that nuclear weapons could only be used on the explicit authorization of the President of the United States. This was the public doctrine. The classified reality was considerably more complex. Beginning in the Eisenhower administration and continuing through subsequent presidencies, the United States maintained a system in which certain commanders in the field had been granted pre-delegated authority to use nuclear weapons under defined circumstances. The circumstances were formally defined as situations in which communications with the president had been severed and an attack was clearly underway or clearly imminent. In practice, the definitions of clearly underway and clearly imminent were left to the judgment of individual commanders operating under conditions of extreme pressure, degraded communications, and incomplete information. The documents that have been declassified in this area reveal a system that was, by any reasonable measure, not fully under presidential control. Field commanders in Europe during the 1950s and early 1960s had nuclear weapons physically in their possession and had been given authority to use them under conditions that a sufficiently alarmed or sufficiently misinformed officer might conclude had been met. The nuclear artillery shells deployed to European theater units in this period were not subject to the kind of permissive action-link technology that would later be developed to prevent unauthorized use. They were weapons that a determined or panicked officer could, in principle, employ without any authorization from Washington whatsoever. The system relied not on technical locks, but on the discipline and judgment of the individuals in possession of the weapons. That the system did not produce a catastrophic, unauthorized use during this period appears to owe more to fortune than to design. The third plan in this accounting involves the procedures that governed what American war planners called continuity of government. The fundamental problem facing any nuclear-armed state during this period was the possibility that a first strike by the adversary might decapitate the government before it could authorize a retaliatory response. If the president, the vice president, the cabinet, and the congressional leadership could all be killed in the first minutes of a nuclear attack, who would have the authority to order retaliation, and how would that authority be transmitted to the forces that remained? The answer the United States developed was a system of dispersal, hardening, and succession that was maintained in extraordinary secrecy for decades. The Mount Weather Special Facility in Virginia was one component of this system. Carved into a hillside in the Blue Ridge Mountains, it was designed to house the executive branch of the American government during and after a nuclear attack. It had its own power generation, its own water supply, its own medical facilities, its own communications infrastructure, and enough provisions to sustain hundreds of government personnel for an extended period. What it did not have, and what the planners of this facility apparently never fully resolved, was a coherent answer to the question of what legitimate governance would look like after a nuclear exchange that had killed most of the American population. The facility was designed to preserve the forms of government. Whether those forms would retain any meaning in the environment that would follow a nuclear war was a question that the plans did not address. Alongside Mount Weather, the system included a fleet of airborne command posts, aircraft that would carry senior military and civilian officials aloft during a crisis, on the theory that a moving aircraft was harder to destroy than a fixed facility. The most famous of these was the E-4B National Airborne Operations Center, sometimes called the Doomsday Plane. Less well known is the extent to which these aircraft were kept on continuous alert, with crews ready to launch within minutes throughout the Cold War. The aircraft carried communications equipment that would allow the president, if aboard, to communicate with nuclear forces and authorize strikes even while airborne. They also carried, in their classified document packages, the procedures that would govern nuclear employment in circumstances where normal command channels had been destroyed. The existence of these procedures and the specific conditions under which they would be activated remained classified long after the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union developed its own version of continuity of government planning, and the fourth contingency plan in this accounting involves a system that the West did not fully understand until after the Soviet collapse. The system known as perimeter, sometimes called dead hand in Western accounts, was a semi-automated nuclear launch system designed to ensure that the Soviet Union could retaliate against an American nuclear attack, even if the entire Soviet leadership had been killed. The system worked by maintaining a network of sensors that would detect the signatures of nuclear detonations on Soviet territory. If those sensors registered an attack, and if the normal command channels for authorizing a retaliatory strike had gone silent, the perimeter system would, after a delay, and after checking a series of conditions, issue launch commands directly to Soviet missile forces without requiring authorization from any surviving human authority. The perimeter system was not fully automated in the sense that it would launch without any human involvement under any circumstances. There was a human element in its operation, but that human element was reduced to a single officer or a small crew sheltered in a hardened bunker, whose role was not to decide whether to retaliate, but simply to confirm that the conditions for perimeter's autonomous operation had been met, and to refrain from intervening to stop the launch sequence. The system was designed around the assumption that the worst-case scenario was not a mistaken nuclear launch, but a failure to retaliate, that American planners might, in theory, calculate that a sufficiently comprehensive first strike could eliminate Soviet retaliatory capability, and that the only way to prevent this calculation from being made was to guarantee retaliation under any circumstances whatsoever. What the perimeter system represented, in its institutional logic, was the endpoint of a particular kind of strategic thinking, the point at which deterrence had been pursued to such an extreme that it had been partially removed from human control. Soviet planners understood this. They built the system anyway because the alternative, in their assessment, was worse. The existence of perimeter was not officially confirmed by Russian authorities until 1993, 2 years after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Whether the system remained operational after that point was not addressed in the confirmation. The hardware that supported it did not disappear when the Cold War ended. The fifth contingency plan involves a category of event that Cold War planners called broken arrows, the accidental loss, destruction, or unauthorized launch of nuclear weapons. The official American Broken Arrow list that has been partially declassified acknowledges 32 incidents involving American nuclear weapons between 1950 and 1980. The actual number is almost certainly higher, and the incidents that have been acknowledged range in severity from the loss of a nuclear weapon overboard from a carrier deck to the accidental dropping of nuclear bombs over American soil that came within a single failed safety mechanism of detonating. The 1961 Goldsboro incident in North Carolina, in which a B-52 carrying two Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke apart during a mid-air emergency and released both weapons over farmland, illustrates the specific character of these risks. One of the two weapons fell in a manner consistent with an armed delivery, going through several of the arming steps that would normally precede detonation. A post-incident investigation determined that a single low-voltage switch, a component that could fail for reasons unrelated to any deliberate action, was the only thing that had prevented detonation. A nuclear weapon with a yield of approximately 4 megatons detonating over eastern North Carolina would have produced casualties and contamination across a substantial portion of the eastern seaboard. The incident was classified. The investigation findings were classified. The public did not learn the details until documents were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act decades later. What the Broken Arrow incidents collectively reveal is not that the American nuclear arsenal was carelessly managed, but that the management of thousands of nuclear weapons deployed across dozens of locations, transported continuously by aircraft and ships, maintained under conditions of operational readiness that required them to be kept in states close to launch. Ready inevitably produced a statistical distribution of accidents, failures, and near misses that no amount of procedural discipline could reduce to zero. The weapons were dangerous. The protocols were imperfect. The humans operating the system made errors. The fact that none of these incidents resulted in a nuclear detonation is a reflection of redundant safety mechanisms, many of which functioned as designed, but also of luck, of the specific failure modes that occurred happening to be ones that the safety systems were designed to catch. The sixth contingency plan that shaped this era involves the procedures that governed American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe under NATO arrangements. Throughout much of the Cold War, the United States maintained nuclear weapons on the territory of its European allies under arrangements that were deliberately obscured in their details from public understanding. The weapons were American property, under American custody protocols, but they were deployed in a context where their actual use in a European conflict would necessarily involve the territory and the security of allied nations that had their own governments, their own populations, and their own calculations about when nuclear weapons should and should not be used. The dual key arrangements that nominally governed these weapons, under which both American authorization and the authorization of the host nation were theoretically required for use, were in practice considerably more complicated. Documents that have been declassified in this area reveal that the actual procedures in place at various points during the Cold War did not always reflect the dual-key model in its idealized form. There were periods when the physical security arrangements around certain NATO nuclear weapons were such that a sufficiently determined actor could have gained access to the weapons without completing the nominally required authorization process. There were also periods of deliberate ambiguity about exactly what each element of an Allied government had been told about the weapons deployed on its territory. Ambiguity maintained on the theory that public knowledge of the specific deployments would generate domestic political opposition that would undermine the strategic deterrent value of the deployments. The seventh contingency plan in this accounting involves the American system for transmitting nuclear launch orders to ballistic missile submarines, a system whose technical requirements created a particular category of strategic vulnerability that planners spent decades trying to address. Nuclear-armed submarines represented, from the beginning of their deployment, the most survivable component of the American nuclear triad, on the theory that a submarine operating silently beneath the ocean surface was effectively impossible to locate and destroy in the time available during a nuclear exchange. But this survivability came at a cost. A submarine submerged to operational depth could not receive normal radio communications. The frequencies that penetrate to operational submarine depths carry very low data rates, meaning that transmitting even a short message to a submarine required minutes or hours of transmission time. The procedures that governed submarine launch authority during the Cold War created a system in which submarines were, in certain defined circumstances, authorized to launch their missiles without receiving a positive launch order from the National Command Authority. The specific conditions under which this authority would be exercised were classified, but the basic logic was that if a submarine crew, using the limited information available to them from their position beneath the ocean, concluded that the United States had been subjected to a nuclear attack and that the normal chain of command had been destroyed, they were expected to take independent action. The question of how a submarine crew, isolated from all normal sources of information, would reliably distinguish between an actual nuclear attack and a communications failure or a technical malfunction that had created the appearance of an attack was one that the procedures did not cleanly resolve. The 8th Contingency Plan involves a series of war games and exercises that the United States and NATO conducted during the 1980s, the most significant of which was the exercise known as Able Archer 83. The exercise, conducted in November 1983, was a command post exercise designed to simulate NATO procedures for the transition from conventional to nuclear warfare. It involved realistic simulations of nuclear release procedures, changes in communications formats, and a higher level of realistic detail than previous exercises of this type. What American planners did not fully appreciate at the time was that Soviet intelligence, which had been closely monitoring American and NATO military activities throughout this period, interpreted elements of Able Archer 83 as potentially being a cover for an actual nuclear first strike. The Soviet reaction to Able Archer 83, which was pieced together from intelligence reporting and later from declassified Soviet documents, included the placing of nuclear-armed aircraft on alert in Eastern Europe and the preparation of certain Soviet nuclear forces for immediate launch. Soviet military and intelligence officials debated, during the period of the exercise, whether what they were observing was an exercise or the preliminary phase of an actual attack. The margin by which they concluded it was an exercise rather than an attack appears to have been narrow. An American intelligence officer operating within the Soviet military establishment provided reporting during this period that allowed American analysts to understand in real time that the Soviets were genuinely alarmed. The policy response to this reporting was deliberately kept quiet, on the theory that acknowledging how close the situation had come to escalation would itself create instability. The 9th plan that belongs in this accounting is the series of protocols that govern the behavior of American early warning systems, which during certain periods of the Cold War generated false indications of incoming Soviet missile attacks with a regularity that is deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, operating from its underground facility inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, maintained continuous watch over a network of radars and satellites designed to detect the launch of Soviet missiles and provide warning of an attack. The system was designed to give American decision-makers the minutes of warning necessary to launch retaliatory forces before those forces could be destroyed by incoming warheads. In June 1980, the NORAD warning system generated a series of indications suggesting that Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles had been fired at the United States. Bomber crews were scrambled. Missile crews went to a higher state of alert. The president's military aide retrieved the nuclear release authorization codes. Within minutes, the indications were assessed as false, the result of a faulty integrated circuit in a communications computer that had introduced erroneous data into the warning display. The total time between the initial false indication and the determination that it was false was approximately 6 minutes. The investigation that followed determined that the specific failure mode had not been anticipated in the system design. Corrective procedures were implemented. Several months later, the system generated another false alarm caused by a different technical failure. This pattern of unanticipated failure modes generating false attack indications that required human judgment to identify as false within very compressed time windows continued throughout the Cold War. The Soviet early warning system experienced similar failures, some of which are better documented than others. The Soviet false alarm incident of September 1983 represents one of the most consequential near misses of the entire Cold War, and it constitutes the 10th contingency plan in this accounting in the sense that the existence of the automated alert system was itself a plan. A decision to create a system that would under certain conditions require a single officer to make a decision about the fate of civilization with incomplete information and no time for consultation. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at a Soviet early warning facility outside Moscow when the facility's satellite-based detection system reported the launch of an American intercontinental ballistic missile. Then it reported a second launch, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. The system was indicating that the United States had launched a nuclear attack. Petrov's assessment made in the minutes that followed was that the indications were false. His reasoning was not procedural but intuitive and analytical. A genuine American first strike, he reasoned, would not involve 5 missiles. It would involve hundreds. The detection system was newly operational and known to have technical issues. He reported the indications as a system malfunction rather than a genuine attack. He was correct. The indications were the result of a rare alignment of sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds in a way that the satellite sensors interpreted as missile plumes. The investigation that followed confirmed his assessment. The incident was classified. Petrov was neither punished nor decorated. The specific vulnerability in the detection system that had produced the false alarm was noted and addressed. Petrov did not publicly discuss the incident for years, and the full account did not become widely known in the West until considerably later. The 11th plan in this accounting involves the systematic effort by American strategic planners to develop and maintain the capability to destroy Soviet ballistic missiles in their silos before they could be launched. A mission that came to be known as a counterforce capability and that represented perhaps the most strategically destabilizing objective of the entire Cold War. The logic of counterforce was, from a purely military planning perspective, straightforward. If American missiles were accurate enough and numerous enough to destroy Soviet missiles in their hardened underground silos before those Soviet missiles could be launched, then the Soviet retaliatory capability could be negated. A sufficiently comprehensive first strike could, in theory, leave the Soviet Union without the means to respond. The destabilizing implication of this logic was that it made the Soviets' strategic calculus deeply asymmetric. If the Soviets believed or feared that the Americans were developing a genuine first strike capability, then the rational Soviet response was to adopt a launch-on-warning posture, meaning a commitment to launch their missiles the moment warning of an incoming American attack was received, before those missiles could be destroyed in their silos. A launch-on-warning posture, in turn, meant that the Soviet response to any false alarm, any technical malfunction, any ambiguous radar return would be the launch of hundreds of nuclear-armed missiles. The American pursuit of counterforce capability thus created, as a direct strategic consequence, a Soviet posture in which the safety of the world depended on the perfect reliability of Soviet early warning systems. Those systems were not perfectly reliable. The 12th contingency plan involves a set of American programs that were designed to ensure that the United States could communicate with its nuclear forces even after a nuclear exchange had destroyed normal communications infrastructure. The most significant of these was the Minimum Essential Emergency Communications Network, a system that combined hardened ground facilities, airborne relay aircraft, and very low-frequency transmitters capable of reaching submerged submarines to create a communications backbone that would, in theory, survive a nuclear attack. The system was maintained at enormous cost throughout the Cold War and represented a genuine engineering achievement in its ability to maintain communications under extreme conditions. What the system could not address was the problem of message authentication. In the aftermath of a nuclear exchange, with normal command structures potentially destroyed and communications operating through degraded and contested channels, how would a submarine commander or a missile crew verify that the launch order they were receiving was genuine and came from a legitimate authority rather than from an adversary attempting a deception, a technical malfunction generating spurious signals, or a damaged friendly system transmitting unintended data. The authentication systems that were developed for this purpose were sophisticated, but they depended on the survival of specific elements of the command structure and the integrity of specific communications paths. The scenarios in which minimum essential emergency communications network would be most critically needed were precisely the scenarios in which those authentication systems would be most severely stressed. The 13th plan involves the little-discussed category of contingency planning that American military planners called decapitation, the deliberate targeting of Soviet political and military leadership in the opening phase of a nuclear conflict. American strategic planning, particularly in the 1980s, incorporated an explicit objective of destroying the Soviet command structure in the early stages of a nuclear exchange, on the theory that eliminating the Soviet leadership would degrade the ability of Soviet forces to coordinate a coherent, retaliatory response. The targeting of Soviet command bunkers, communications facilities, and leadership locations was incorporated into the PSYOP and into the planning documents of the various military services. The strategic logic of decapitation, like the logic of counterforce, contained within it a profound destabilizing paradox. If Soviet planners understood, as they clearly did, that American targeting doctrine included their leadership, then the rational response was to develop systems that would ensure retaliation even if the entire leadership was killed. Perimeter was one such response. Another was the development of procedures that delegated launch authority further down the chain of command to officers whose locations would be less well known to American targeters. The American pursuit of decapitation capability thus directly incentivized the Soviets to build systems in which individual officers of relatively junior rank had authority to initiate nuclear launches without reference to the national leadership. The system designed to limit Soviet retaliation created as a direct consequence a more distributed and harder to eliminate Soviet retaliatory capability. The 14th plan in this accounting involves the contingency planning that was conducted around the specific problem of what military planners called escalation control, the question of how a conventional military conflict between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces in Europe might be prevented from escalating to nuclear use. The planning for this contingency was among the most extensive and most classified of the entire Cold War period, because the scenario of a conventional conflict in Europe was not theoretical. It was the scenario that NATO and Warsaw Pact forces were actually organized and equipped to fight. The documents that have been declassified in this area reveal a planning process that was, in its essentials, deeply pessimistic about the possibility of controlling escalation once conventional conflict had begun. The conventional military balance in Europe during the Cold War favored the Warsaw Pact in terms of ground forces and armor, particularly in the early stages of a conflict before American reinforcements could arrive from across the Atlantic. NATO planning for the defense of Western Europe therefore incorporated, from a relatively early point, the planned use of tactical nuclear weapons to compensate for this conventional imbalance. The weapons existed in enormous numbers. By the early 1970s, there were more than 7,000 American tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. Their use was incorporated into NATO operational plans at relatively low thresholds of conventional military setback. The problem with this planning was that the Soviet Union did not accept the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons as meaningful in the operational context of a European war. Soviet military doctrine held that any use of nuclear weapons on the territory of the Soviet Union or its allies would be met with a nuclear response that would not be limited in scale or scope. The threshold at which NATO planned to use tactical nuclear weapons was therefore, from the Soviet perspective, the threshold at which a general nuclear exchange would begin. NATO planners understood this. Their plans incorporated the use of tactical nuclear weapons anyway, because the alternative was to accept that a conventional Warsaw Pact offensive might overrun Western Europe. The contingency plans for the defense of Western Europe were, in their essential logic, plans that accepted a high probability of general nuclear war as a cost of attempting to defend European territory. The 15th contingency plan involves the systematic effort by both the United States and the Soviet Union to develop and deploy multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, a technology that allowed a single missile to carry multiple warheads aimed at different targets. The development of this technology, which American planners called MIRVing, was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire Cold War arms race, and it was made in both countries with relatively limited consideration of its strategic implications. The implications were severe. A single missile carrying 10 warheads could, if those warheads were accurate enough, theoretically destroy 10 enemy missiles in their silos. This meant that a country with a large MIRV-equipped missile force could, in theory, expend a fraction of its arsenal to destroy the adversary's entire missile force, retaining the remainder as a reserve force. The development of MIRV technology thus created, for the first time, a situation in which the mathematics of nuclear warfare favored the side that struck first. If each MIRV warhead could destroy more than one enemy missile, then a first strike could, in theory, leave the striker with more weapons after the exchange than the defender. This inverted the stability logic that had previously governed nuclear deterrence. Rather than both sides having every incentive to avoid striking first, both sides now had a potential incentive to strike first if they believed the other side was about to do so. The decision to develop and deploy MIRV technology, made in both countries by technical and military experts operating within their respective institutional frameworks, had transformed the strategic environment in ways that the political leaders who nominally authorized the decision had not fully grasped. The 16th plan involves a category of contingency that American planners designated under various classified code names, but that addressed a consistent underlying problem. What would happen if Soviet intelligence achieved a comprehensive understanding of American nuclear targeting, basing, and command procedures sufficient to plan a disarming first strike with high confidence of success? The scenario was technically demanding because it required Soviet intelligence to achieve simultaneously an accurate picture of the locations of all American nuclear weapons, the schedules and routes of all nuclear-capable delivery systems, the locations and communications methods of all command and control facilities, and the specific vulnerabilities in the authentication and launch procedures that would allow a first strike to be optimally timed. The measures taken to address this vulnerability included elaborate programs of deception, compartmentalization, and operational security that pervaded every aspect of American nuclear operations. The specific locations of missile silos were, of course, not secret. They were visible from satellite imagery. What was kept secret was the maintenance schedules that temporarily degraded the readiness of specific missiles, the communications procedures and frequencies used for launch authority transmission, and the locations of mobile command elements that would be critical to coordinating a retaliatory response. The counterintelligence programs associated with protecting this information represented an enormous institutional investment, one that was sustained across decades and that shaped the culture and practices of American intelligence agencies in ways that persisted long after the Cold War ended. The 17th contingency plan in this accounting involves the planning that was done around the specific scenario of a nuclear conflict initiated not by the United States or the Soviet Union, but by a third party, either a smaller nuclear-armed state acting on its own initiative or a proxy or allied state acting with the tacit or explicit support of one of the superpowers. This scenario was taken seriously by planners on both sides from a relatively early point. The proliferation of nuclear weapons beyond the original American monopoly created a category of contingency that the bilateral deterrence framework was not designed to address. The specific concern that received the most attention was the possibility that China, which detonated its first nuclear device in 1964, might initiate a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union, creating pressure on the United States to respond in ways that were not clearly defined by existing plans. There were also concerns about smaller allied states. Israel's nuclear weapons program, which was not officially acknowledged by either Israel or the United States, but was well understood by American intelligence from the late 1960s onward, created a category of contingency in which an Israeli decision to use nuclear weapons in the context of a Middle Eastern conflict might trigger Soviet involvement and escalation to a superpower confrontation that had not been initiated by either superpower. The planning documents addressing these scenarios have been among the most tightly held of any from this period, and relatively few have been declassified. The 18th plan involves the procedures that governed American nuclear operations during the specific period of a presidential transition. The hours and days around the inauguration of a new president, when the outgoing president's authority had lapsed and the incoming president had not yet been fully integrated into the command and control system. The nuclear football, the briefcase carried by a military aide that contained the authentication codes and communications equipment necessary for a president to authorize a nuclear launch, had to be transferred from the outgoing to the incoming president in a process that was, by the nature of its security requirements, difficult to make completely seamless. The specific vulnerabilities in this transition process have been discussed in general terms by participants in several such transitions, and the picture that emerges is one of a system that was less robust during these brief periods than American doctrine suggested. There were inaugurations during which the precise chain of custody of nuclear release authority was ambiguous for a period of minutes. There were periods during transitions when the specific communications protocols that would have been used to transmit a launch order had not yet been confirmed with all relevant parties. The system was designed to function continuously and without interruption. But the human element of the system changed completely every 4 or 8 years, and the documentation and procedures for managing those changes evolved over time rather than being optimally designed from the beginning. The 19th Contingency Plan involves a set of procedures that govern the behavior of American nuclear forces during periods of heightened tension, when the president was unavailable, incapacitated, or otherwise unable to fulfill the normal command authority role. The legal and constitutional framework for presidential succession was well established, but the specific nuclear command procedures that would govern a situation in which the president was, for example, under anesthesia during a medical procedure, or temporarily out of communications range, or physically located in an area where the communications infrastructure for transmitting nuclear release authority was unavailable, required a set of practical arrangements that went beyond what the formal succession law addressed. The specific arrangements that were made for these situations, including the procedures for delegating nuclear release authority to the vice president or other successors during periods of presidential unavailability, were among the most sensitive planning documents in the American government. The account of what actually happened during certain historical episodes, including the period in 1981, immediately following the attempted assassination of President Reagan, when Secretary of State Alexander Haig made his now famous statement about being in control, reflects the confusion that can exist in real-time crisis situations between the formal legal framework and the practical operational reality of nuclear command authority. The 20th plan in this accounting involves the Soviet analog to American continuity of government planning, a system that was more extensive and more systematically developed than its American counterpart, and that remained almost entirely unknown to Western intelligence until after the Soviet collapse. The Soviet system included a network of deep underground facilities far more extensive than anything the United States had built, bunkers and tunnels extending hundreds of meters beneath Moscow and other major cities, connected by a dedicated subway system that had been constructed in secret alongside the public Moscow metro. The facilities were designed to house the Soviet leadership, the military command staff, and the communications equipment necessary to coordinate a nuclear war from deep underground for an extended period following a nuclear attack. The scale of this construction, revealed through a combination of defector testimony, signals intelligence, and post-Soviet investigation, represented an investment of resources that reflected a Soviet approach to nuclear war planning that differed from the American approach in important ways. Where American continuity of government planning tended to emphasize dispersal and mobility, the Soviet approach emphasized hardening and depth. Where American plans relied on airborne command posts and dispersed ground facilities, Soviet plans relied on underground facilities that were designed to survive near-miss nuclear detonations, and that were connected by hardened communications links that would remain functional even in the aftermath of multiple nuclear strikes in the vicinity. The 21st Contingency Plan involves the American program known as the Emergency Rocket Communications System, a system that represented one of the more technically specific solutions to the problem of communicating with nuclear forces through the electromagnetic disruption that would follow a nuclear exchange. The system worked by launching modified ballistic missiles whose warheads had been replaced with radio transmitters that would broadcast authentication codes and launch orders as they traveled through the upper atmosphere. A submarine or land-based missile crew equipped with the right receivers and the right authentication codes could receive launch orders from these transmitter missiles even if all other communications links had been severed. The system was operational for a significant portion of the Cold War, maintained as a backup to other communications methods. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged for many years after it was deployed. The specific authentication procedures it used, the frequencies it transmitted on, and the procedures for incorporating its messages into a launch sequence were among the most closely guarded details of American nuclear operations. What the system represented, in its institutional logic, was an acceptance that the communications environment following a nuclear exchange would be so degraded that specialized purpose-built systems would be necessary to ensure that launch orders could be transmitted and received with sufficient reliability to constitute an effective retaliatory capability. The 22nd Plan involves the contingency planning that surrounded a specific category of Soviet military capability that American planners called the backfire problem. The Tupolev Tu-22M, known in NATO nomenclature as the backfire, was a Soviet long-range bomber that entered service in the 1970s, and that posed a particular planning challenge because its range and refueling capabilities made it ambiguous in terms of its potential role. Under certain flight profiles with aerial refueling, it could potentially reach the continental United States. Under other profiles, it was clearly a theater weapon designed for use against targets in Western Europe or naval targets in the Atlantic and Pacific. The question of how to count and plan for backfire bombers in American strategic assessments was the subject of extended classified analysis and internal debate. The significance of this ambiguity was not merely technical. The negotiation of strategic arms limitation agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union during the 1970s depended on agreed definitions of what counted as a strategic weapon. Whether the backfire was a strategic weapon under these definitions was a question with direct implications for what was and was not covered by negotiated limits. The Soviet position was that it was a theater weapon. The American position was that it had strategic potential that needed to be addressed in some form. The resolution of this ambiguity, worked out in successive arms control negotiations, reflected the degree to which the entire arms control enterprise during this period was built on classification categories and definitional distinctions that were, in the operational reality of nuclear planning, considerably more fluid than the negotiated treaties suggested. The 23rd Contingency Plan involves the procedures that governed American nuclear operations in the specific scenario of a crisis in which the president was believed to be acting irrationally or incapacitated by factors that might impair judgment. This scenario, which military and civilian planners discussed in classified settings from an early point in the nuclear age, raised a profound structural question. The entire system of nuclear command and control was built around the principle of civilian supremacy and presidential authority. The president alone, in the American system, was the final authority for nuclear release. But the president was a human being, subject to the same range of human vulnerabilities, including psychological breakdown, medication effects, extreme stress, and deliberate manipulation that affected any human being. The planning documents that have been partially declassified in this area reveal a profound tension that was never fully resolved. On one side was the constitutional principle of civilian control and presidential authority, which required that military officers carry out lawful orders from the commander-in-chief. On the other side was the obligation of senior military officers not to participate in what might constitute a war crime or an unauthorized act of enormous destructive consequence. The specific procedures that existed for what a senior military officer should do if ordered to execute a nuclear strike that the officer believed was clearly irrational or clearly illegal were never, in the official American doctrine, clearly defined. The system relied, in the end, on the judgment of individuals in positions of extraordinary responsibility, operating under conditions of extreme pressure without clear procedural guidance for the most extreme scenarios. The 24th plan involves the contingency planning that was done around the specific problem of nuclear terrorism. The possibility that a nuclear weapon or a sufficient quantity of fissile material might be acquired by a non-state actor and used in a way that bypassed the entire superpower deterrence framework. This concern, which existed from the early years of the nuclear age, intensified over time as the number of nuclear-armed states increased and as the physical security of nuclear materials became an issue in an expanding range of countries and facilities. The American planning for nuclear terrorism contingencies included programs for rapid response to credible threats, procedures for assessing the technical characteristics of improvised nuclear devices from limited information, and coordination mechanisms between intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and military forces. The specific vulnerabilities in the security of nuclear materials, including the specific locations where security was considered inadequate and the specific scenarios considered most credible, were among the most tightly held planning documents of this entire category. Some of these documents were so sensitive that they were maintained under special access programs that restricted knowledge of their existence to a very small number of individuals. The existence of this planning and the specific vulnerabilities it identified was itself considered a significant security risk, if disclosed. The 25th contingency plan in this accounting involves the planning that was conducted around the specific scenario of a nuclear conflict that began with an accident or a technical failure rather than a deliberate political decision. This scenario, sometimes called accidental war or inadvertent escalation in the planning literature, was taken seriously by planners on both sides from an early point, and it produced a series of agreements and procedures designed to reduce the risk of accidental conflict. The most significant of these was the direct communications link between Washington and Moscow, the hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was designed to allow rapid, direct communication between the American and Soviet leaderships during a crisis. The hotline was a genuine and valuable risk reduction measure, but it addressed only a specific subset of the accidental war scenarios that planners had identified. It was useful when leaders on both sides were in communication and seeking to manage a crisis. It was of limited utility in scenarios where events were moving faster than diplomatic communication could manage, where one or both sides had incomplete information about what was happening, or where the initiating event was a technical malfunction that had produced consequences before anyone in authority had time to communicate. The planning documents that addressed these faster-moving accidental war scenarios reveal a persistent concern that the systems designed to prevent accidental conflict might not, under all conditions, function in time to prevent catastrophic consequences. The 26th and final contingency plan in this accounting is in some ways the most revealing of all, because it was not a plan for war, but a plan for the aftermath of war. A set of documents addressing what American governance would look like in the period following a nuclear exchange. The Federal Emergency Management Agency and its predecessors maintained planning documents throughout the Cold War that addressed the specific challenges of governing a population that had survived a nuclear attack, managing the distribution of food and medical care in an environment of massive infrastructure destruction, maintaining public order under conditions of extreme social disruption, and conducting the basic functions of democratic governance in the absence of most of the physical and institutional infrastructure on which democratic governance normally depended. These plans were developed with genuine effort and genuine expertise. They incorporated detailed assessments of which governmental functions could be maintained under which conditions, what communications infrastructure would survive various attack scenarios, how authority would be exercised in the absence of normal legal processes, and what the timeline for recovery of basic governmental functions might look like under optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic scenarios. The documents that have been declassified reveal a planning process that was thorough within its own assumptions. The assumptions, however, were deeply problematic. The plans were built around scenarios involving a limited number of nuclear detonations, a few dozen or a few hundred, over a period of hours or days. They did not address scenarios involving the full employment of the arsenals that both sides actually possessed. The estimated casualties in the plans were enormous by any peacetime standard, but were constrained by the planning assumptions in ways that did not reflect the actual scale of nuclear arsenals. The effects of nuclear winter, the global climatic consequences of massive quantities of smoke and particulate matter released by nuclear firestorms, were not incorporated into the planning framework because the scientific understanding of nuclear winter had not yet been fully developed. What the plans for post-nuclear governance reveal, in their specific limitations and their specific assumptions, is that the people who created them were planning for a nuclear war that was survivable in a recognizable sense, a war that would kill enormous numbers of people and destroy enormous amounts of infrastructure, but would leave a functioning society with recognizable institutions and recoverable capabilities. Whether this planning assumption reflected genuine analysis or was a psychological necessity for the people doing the planning, a way of making the work feel meaningful rather than futile, is not entirely clear from the documents themselves. What is clear is that the plans were maintained, updated, exercised, and treated as operational documents throughout the Cold War, and that the existence of post-attack governance plans was itself part of the strategic framework, a signal that the United States intended to survive and govern itself, even in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. The 26 plans described here do not represent the complete universe of Cold War contingency planning. They represent a sample, selected because they have been partially or substantially documented through declassification, witness testimony, or post-Soviet disclosure. The full scope of the planning that was conducted during this period, across both superpowers and their various allies and partners, remains only partially knowable. Some documents will remain classified for years or decades to come. Some were deliberately destroyed. Some were maintained in form so sensitive that the number of individuals who ever had access to them was in the single digits. What the documented plans collectively reveal is a system that was far less stable, far less subject to rational human control, and far more dependent on luck, coincidence, and the individual judgments of people operating under extraordinary pressure than the public understanding of the Cold War has ever fully reflected. The deterrence framework that is credited with preventing nuclear conflict during this period was real, but it functioned within a practical operational environment filled with technical failures, miscommunications, planning assumptions that turned out to be wrong, and near-miss incidents that could, under slightly different circumstances, have produced outcomes that no deterrence theory would have predicted or been able to prevent. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as the moment when the Cold War came closest to nuclear conflict, and the resolution of that crisis through negotiation is frequently cited as evidence that rational actors, given sufficient motivation and sufficient communication, could step back from the brink. What is less often noted is that the missile crisis itself generated several near-miss incidents that were not resolved through negotiation, but through accident or individual decision, including the decision by Soviet submarine commander Vasily Arkhipov not to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch when his submarine was being depth-charged by American forces that were unaware the submarine was nuclear-armed and whose depth charges were intended as signaling devices rather than as attacks. Arkhipav's decision was not a product of the negotiating framework. It was a product of his individual judgment in a situation where the procedures in place gave him authority to act, where his colleagues were advocating for use of the weapon, and where he chose restraint on his own account. The period following the Cuban Missile Crisis saw the implementation of numerous risk reduction measures, hotlines and arms control agreements and procedures designed to reduce the probability of accidental or inadvertent conflict. These measures were genuine and valuable. They did not eliminate the fundamental structural vulnerabilities of a world in which thousands of nuclear weapons were maintained on various states of alert, under command and control systems of necessarily imperfect reliability, in a strategic environment where both sides maintained doctrines that, under certain conditions, rewarded striking first. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, an event that was not predicted by most Western analysts, and that came about through a combination of economic dysfunction, political transformation, and individual decisions whose full history is still being written. The weapons that had been pointed at American cities for 40 years were not destroyed. The command and control systems that had been built to manage them were not dismantled. The planning documents that had been developed over 4 decades describing how to fight and survive a nuclear war were not burned. The institutional knowledge, the targeting databases, the communications protocols, the launch procedures, the pre-delegation authorities that had existed in one form or another since the Eisenhower administration, these things persisted, in modified and in some cases degraded forms, but they persisted. The Cold War ended. The architecture of the Cold War did not.